Well, someone is gonna call me their grandma or tell me that I'm prude, but it is what it is. We all know that sex sells. It's been the motto for ages now, and we see it both in music and the entertainment industry. My admiration for film has always come from its ability to make us feel and think, for encouraging us to question things and have critical discussions and challenge societal norms, and sometimes even experience life from someone else's perspective. So nothing gets on my nerves more than a film with a very cheap plotline that actually doesn't have anything to offer us but shock value to lure us into watching the film. So in this video, I'm going to break down a couple of reasons why I personally feel like sex scenes are actually not necessary. When I say I don't think it's necessary, there are obviously limitations to that. Of course, a director is free to make a film however they please. And sometimes sex scenes are used intentionally and they're meant to do something. So of course, there are times where a director can find it most useful for their film, but I just think in most cases, it's something that can be completely skipped. But without further ado, let's just get into my point. So little disclaimer, I'm sick. If my voice sounds nasally, you know why. So some of the reasons why sex scenes are usually implemented in film and television is to show the chemistry between two characters, or the power balance or imbalance. And other times it's used to literally explore sexuality if that's a major theme in the film. You can also insinuate that shit is going down without actually showing it to us. And I have found that films that do this, it is actually more effective in getting the message, the tone, or the meaning to the scene across. When explicit scenes are intentional, they have a meaning, they have a purpose, and once that purpose is filled, the scene is over, which is the most effective way to do it. There is no really good reason to elongate an explicit scene, other than for the enjoyment of the audience or to get a reaction out of us. If you look at a lot of film and television that use a lot of explicit scenes in it, they have us watching these scenes very voyeuristically. Most of the time when I see a sexually explicit scene in a film, I'm kind of just like, well, we could have gone without seeing that. I don't always actually see how these scenes further the plot or help us understand the story a little bit better. I feel as though a lot of filmmakers these days are just trying to see how far they could go before they reach their limit, and that limit has become a very thin line. Some of these explicit scenes are actually so detailed that the only difference I can find from that versus porn is that I'm not actually physically seeing a private body part go in and out. But otherwise, they're practically the same. So let's look at an example of this. Bridgerton, the first season, for example. Now, I was the biggest hater of season 1, and I saw it as one of those shows that used sex to sell. And that's because a lot of the discord that was going on around the show when it first came on was about how much the two were going at it once they got married. And I'm not interested in that. It does have a decent plot, but there's just so much back-to-back sex scenes that the majority of the conversation around the film was about that. If you look at the second season in comparison, there's only one scene where the characters actually get to fornicating, and even then it's not that explicit. And yet it effectively showcases the tension between the characters and the chemistry that they have. That was one of the times where I could actually say that the scene was pretty tasteful to the plot. Actually, I don't know if I like the word tasteful, but you know what I'm getting at. Let's look at another film, for example. 365 Days. I have seen clips from that film that I never needed to see on TikTok, and there is nothing I can do to erase that off of my memory. That film objectively is so explicit and so detailed with its numerous amount of explicit scenes. And yet the actual storyline is garbage. I mean, it's not even that the story is so corny and lacks any originality or that the acting is horrible. It's just that the dialogue is actually so bad. It's just written so bad.
Are you lost, baby girl?
Even Bridgerton has plot lines that we've heard of before, but at least the actual writing makes it enjoyable to watch, despite the fact that we have heard of these tropes before. But 365 Days offered nothing! And yet the movie blew up. It was all people were talking about when it first came out, and we know exactly why. And we know what people were actually watching for, because it's glorified porn. I actually remember when I was in the 7th grade, it was the first time that 50 Shades of Grey had actually come out, the movie. And one of the girls in my class had bought the book and was reading it. I know, 7th grade, reading 50 Shades of Grey is crazy. And so my teacher, who had seen her reading this book, had approached her about it, especially because the boys in the class were making a scene. They were asking her what the book says and what was going on. It was just a whole thing. And I remember my teacher telling the class that the book and the film was essentially just soft porn. And, you know, that perfectly explains what's being fed to us. That's exactly what the storyline is. That's exactly what the whole plot is. It just allows us to watch things that we feel ashamed to watch, but this time we can do so openly because it's a movie. And of course, I briefly want to mention the male gaze because this is a big part of a lot of these sex scenes. I'm getting really tired of saying sex scenes. I'm sorry, guys. It's like actually not any fun. Many of these films are directed by male directors or are being filmed by male cinematographers, and it puts the actress in question in a very vulnerable place. We're made to believe that these scenes are very integral to the entire storyline of the film, but I think it really just is an avenue that allows men to sexualize women, both in real life, like when you're actually making the movie, and to all the viewers that are watching. It has us looking at the woman, her body, and what she can do in bed. And I think it just creates this expectation for young men to think that women that they sleep with are all going to act this way and are going to be these super sexy objects that they can just play around with rather than real people. And real people don't always look like what we see on film and television. It's realism versus media. And you have to remember that intimacy coordinators are a very new phenomenon. They did not exist even just a couple years ago. For those of you who don't know what an intimacy coordinator is, they are people specifically on film sets to focus on the consent and the comfort of the actresses and actors. And they're usually used for a lot of graphic scenes, a lot of sexually explicit scenes, just to ensure that the people involved are comfortable all throughout it, which is great because then there's someone who's specifically in charge of just making sure that the people who are doing these scenes feel comfortable throughout, and that if there's ever a moment where they are uncomfortable or they don't actually want to do something, there's somebody else that can speak up for them on set. Because there are so many people involved on film sets, and sometimes it's a little too overwhelming as an actor to be able to say, I'm actually not comfortable with this. And that's why we have intimacy coordinators. They handle that for you. Okay, editor Sarah here, and I just want to mention a couple of things that I forgot to emphasize in the video. I'm not discouraging sex scenes just to be like, oh, I don't like them, or they're ugly, or they're distasteful. We know for a fact that Hollywood has a very dark history, and there's a lot of things that goes on in productions that we don't know about. I mean, we can just look back in history and see how many ugly things have actually gone on behind the scenes that the public didn't know about until way later. We've seen kids and women be exploited and sexualized, and intimacy coordinators didn't become a thing until after the Me Too movement, until after women started to come out and say, hey, these things have happened to me, and women in the industry called out directors, producers, and other people with really big titles in the industry for their abuse and how they use their power against women who are in a very vulnerable position, especially when it comes to films where there is a lot of intimacy involved. So I feel like if we look at some of these films where a lot of these explicit scenes are prevalent, there could be a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, and it's something to really think about. Why does a director choose to put so many explicit scenes in a film where it's really not necessary? If it's not affecting the art, if it's not making the art better or worse, then I think we can go without it. I'm just here to encourage people to ask questions about art that's being made and the artists involved, because you can't always separate the art from the artist. And when you actually start to critically look at things and ask a few questions, you uncover things that weren't on the surface. If we look at some artists who have been accused or found guilty of certain crimes, those crimes were always prevalent in their artwork. It's just that we didn't bother to see it because we didn't want to. I want to touch on how these scenes can actually really screw our understanding of sex in real life, especially for young people, for young adults, and even in a lot of shows that are targeted towards teens, there are a lot of these really explicit sex scenes, and that also affects how young people who are underage will perceive sex to be. Because we always see it as such an intense and passionate act, it gets people to start thinking that that's how it should always be in your real life, when that's actually not the truth. And I think some films do a really good job of actually portraying what these moments actually feel like in real life. For example, in the movie Lady Bird, when Lady Bird loses her virginity, it's a very awkward and quick-lived scene, and I think that does a really great job of bringing to life what these experiences can often feel like. It's not always this great grandeur moment. A lot of the times it's awkward, it's slow, like there are variations to it. And of course, you might argue that film isn't supposed to be real life, that it's supposed to be an escape. At the end of the day, it is a film. Regardless, film imitates life, and seeing the same pattern of sex scenes over and over again is obviously going to affect the way people perceive this interaction to go in real life, especially those of us that are very impressionable because we're much younger. If you look at Euphoria, for example, I guess the intended audience is supposed to be teenagers because it's supposed to be a portrayal of high school. Sam Levinson needs to be in jail. I actually already made a video about Euphoria on my channel that you can check out to hear my specific opinions about that show in particular, but it does the exact thing that I'm describing. It makes sex on young people look so voyeuristic, look so passionate, look so rah, and it makes young people yearn for that, search for that. And if they don't experience that in their real life, it can be very confusing and jarring and make a lot of people feel like either they're doing something wrong or they're not experiencing life the right way. The, I think, second special episode that came out just before the actual season 2 came out, which was following Jules and her trying to navigate life after ending things on a rocky note with Rue. And there was a whole scene where she was not dating. And I mean, think about that for a second. She's a high school character and we are watching her please herself, and it was shot so artistically, so beautifully. And I mean, like, that's great, but why are we watching a high schooler do all of that? I feel like that experience when you're so young isn't so glamorous. It's honestly quite the opposite. It's a lot of discovering, experimenting, figuring it out. So why are we seeing these depictions over and over again on a show that's claimed to be so realistic? It just doesn't make sense to me. And finally, I want to touch on how a lot of films where sex scenes are very prevalent to the storyline and are very prominent in the film actually promote a lot of violence and abuse against women. And I'm going to use 50 Shades of Grey and 365 Days as an example. In 50 Shades of Grey, it's very clear that there are power imbalances being played here. Christian is a very controlling and demanding character. He very much wants to have his hands all over Anastasia and control everything that she does and limit her freedoms. And it's written off as this sexy, protective behavior of a man who's troubled and who's been through a lot. But in real life, these behaviors don't translate as love or affection or protection. A lot of the times, these behaviors in real life translate to violence and abuse against women. Like when a man pulls you back into a room that you're trying to leave, it isn't him trying to hold you and be affectionate towards you. In real life, a lot of the times, that's a man who won't let you walk out of a room that you don't feel safe in. Even in 365 Days, the whole plot is this man, Massimo, if that's his name, coercing this woman into being with him, literally kidnapping her and keeping her to himself until she gives in to him. What? If that happened in real life, do you think the ending would be that great? It starts to write off a lot of these very common abusive behaviors as sexy, as things that we should want as women. We should want for a man to not let us exit a room that we don't want to be in. We should want a man to follow us and stalk us and to not leave our sight after we've told them over and over again that we don't want to speak to them or we don't want to see them again. But these things are actually very dangerous in real life, and the men who do these things in real life do not actually love you. They don't care, matter of fact. They just want to control, they want to be in charge, and they will do whatever they have to do to get what they want out of you. And so I'm tired of seeing films where men's bad behaviors are being written off as something sexy and something that we should want and something super desirable, when it actually is very much a problem that needs to be seen as such. With all of that being said, I want to conclude this video by saying that I'm not better than anyone. I've obviously seen a lot of different films and shows that have been sexually explicit, and I have not lowered my gaze. I've watched them. Growing up, becoming more and more mature and being a little more critical of the things that I'm watching, I've started to realize just what's going on, and that's why I have some of these opinions. So I'm really curious to see what you guys think about this topic. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, if you agree, if you disagree, if you've got some points that I might have missed or counter arguments. As usual, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like this video. And if you have not subscribed already, what is you doing, bruv? Get to it. We're actually so close to hitting 500, so I'm excited to see that happen. As always, I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.